Thanks for joining me for part 5 of guardrails, wing rails, and frogs. I'm going to work first on this guardrail. I've cut a length of rail about the length of the one on the template. I want to dress it up just a little bit. I see that my nipper has left some burrs on the bottom, so I'll take that off. And again on the other end, just take that off. Now in the Fast Tracks video, they've got some really nice suggestions, and I'm going to do those with us now. First, we're going to bend the guardrail. And for me, I just take my favorite pair of flat nose pliers and I bend it to an angle that's probably a little more severe than the Fast Tracks template, but I'm consistent and I think it works well. Now, Fast Tracks and some of the other real good hand laying videos say that we need to taper this guardrail point just a little bit. What we want to do is we want to angle up here on the rail head, angle it inward, and in the web width we want to angle it outward. So one of the ways we can do that is take the file and put the rail in kind of a downward angle and just give a couple scrapes along my file. And I hope you can see what we've done there. That curved portion of the wing rail, a guardrail, now has a little point to it. And we do the same thing for the other side. And again, I've got that same kind of flared, angled point there. Next comes where to position this. And because we're doing a custom sort of layout, our measurements are not always exactly the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to look for the position for this frog, which is what this guardrail is for. This one guards the narrow gauge rail. So I'm going to take a T-square and I'm going to lay it in the middle of my frog. And when I put it there, I'm going to put a mark on the outside rail. And you can see I've already put the mark there, but I'll just do it again. So there is where I want to center the guardrail. I've done that procedure for these two guardrails already. So now we'll take our flux paste, paste the inside web of the rail and the inside web of the guardrail. I'm going to pre-position this, and I can see that I now have a railroad spike that has interfered with this position. So I'm going to pull that out. There shouldn't be any big lateral forces on the rail at this point, so if you lose a point or two of securing the rails, it shouldn't be a big deal. I'm fortunate in that the micro-engineering rail that I'm using, if I just put it rail base to rail base, it's almost exactly the gauge I need. Now on the NMRA flangeway guides, we've got 2 of them that we can use here, and these are the flangeways for the guardrails. The middle one is the flangeway for the point rails. Because I'm using O-scale wheels that are a little bit larger in dimension, I've decided to use this middle one for all of my flangeways. And if I have some problems in ON30, I may have to come back in and fill the flangeway with solder and then make it reset it as narrower. But as I set the gauge, it's awfully darn close, and I've learned that I can just push the rail bases together and I get the right number. I mean the right width. So having that together, I'm now going to take my chisel point soldering iron and just hold the rail down in the middle. You don't need a lot of solder to hold these in place. And if you want to be real finesse, you can do them out at the ends where the actual rail guard or guardrails would be secured. But I'm just going to put a blob in the middle. Again, I want it to melt when it touches the rail, not the solder iron. And it is doing that. So I'm just going to feed a big amount of solder into the space. I'm going to hold the rail. Yep, it slid. Let's get it just backed up and pushed right back where it needs to go. In a little. My solder has solidified, so we're going to have to melt it back down, get it close. There we go. I'm going to hold the rail in place, and then I can draw the solder by heating the rail at the extremities, and the flux paste will pull that with it. I'm going to let the solder solidify. I'll come back with my gauge, and I can see that it's just so close. If I do need to do anything, I can just do that with a file. So that is the guardrails. Now I'm going to work on a frog rail, and on the fast track method, this point rail would be curved and it would become this frog rail right there. And that's what would guide the wheels through the frog, but I haven't made it that way. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to taper the end of this rail and get it so that it matches the angle of the frog. Again, I'll just lay out my file. I'm going to do my best to make a guess what angle that is. So a couple of long strokes. A couple of long strokes on my file. A little test fit to see how I'm doing. My angle is really pretty good, so I want to continue the angle until I've got the filed surface coming right out to that point on the rail head. So a couple more passes, keeping that same angle. Okay, my angle now comes out to the far edge of the railhead, but the angle's not quite shallow enough. I'll make the angle more shallow and fine tune it here. Let's see how that looks. You know what? I'm pretty satisfied with that. I can see there's a little gap there. It doesn't make a continuous edge of the rail head as it would if you were to bend it the way Fast Tracks wants, but I'm satisfied with that. I'm going to go ahead and solder that in place. So before we do that, we've got to come out here and we've got to make the angled end. So it looks like I have to trim the end a little bit. I want I'm going to cut the rail off a little bit. I'll put my angle in it. We'll cut the taper on that flange rate entry point. Good. I'm now ready to go ahead and solder that piece in. So again, I'll get my flux paste. I'll flux the web of the rail where the piece is going to go. I'll flux the inside rail web for our piece. I'll approximate it to gauge here. I can check it a little bit with my NMRA gauge. A little bit narrow. Let's go out. Widen it just a little bit. Check the gauge again. A little narrow. I think I'm going to go ahead and put it right there. Okay. I'm going to put most of my soldering iron on that frog rail. I don't want to do too much to my frog point. Let it get warmed up. Good. Welcome back. Had a little bit of a soldering disaster there. So I've now got the frog guard in position again. We'll try this again. So laying the soldering iron on the rail, putting a little solder down in the space. Again, I got a little creep of that rail when I finally got it heated up. And it looks like we finally have it. As I bring the NMRA gauge in, it's going to be too narrow. I can tell already. So we're going to warm it up a little bit. I use the chisel point to pull the gap apart a little bit. Okay, with it in position at this end, I'm going to freeze up this end of the solder joint. With a little luck, we'll measure this portion and it'll be in gauge enough. That's close enough. I want to get a little solder here in the top of this joint right here, just so that it looks good and flows smoothly. But I don't want to heat up the rest of the joint too much. There we go. It was a little clumsy. Sorry about that, but that's what happens. I'll go ahead and complete this other frog rail. there's only one guardrail for us left to put in, and that's a rail that's called this wing rail. This is a very shallow angle to it, and what it does is it's going to guide the flange of the standard gauge through route and the flange of the narrow gauge diverging route. Off camera, I've taken a piece of rail and I've put a slight bend in it to match this angle of this frog. I've bent the edges and tapered the tips of the rail head, and after a test fit, there's just a little bit of solder and debris down in here. I've also removed the rail base a little bit on the inside. With that done, I'm hoping that we have a good fit here. So a little bit of flux paste on the inside of the rail, a little bit on the wing rail, get it into position. The thing that I'm looking for is, do I match the flange way width for each of the rails? So over here at the narrow gauge, a little wide, there it's good. The standard gauge, that's good. All right, let's put a little solder to this. With the soldering iron just on the tops of the rails, I'll get them to warm up. I can see that the solder or the flux paste is bubbling and boiling down inside. I want the solder to melt when it touches the rail, not the iron. It's doing that nicely. That's a good tack joint. The narrow gauge could probably come in just a little bit, so I'm gonna get some solder down into the joint. To tack it in place. But while it cools, I'm gonna push it over a little bit and hold it. That solidifies and holds it nicely. Come in and fill in a few spots. Back here at the wing rail for the standard gauge. Fill in the rest of the frog. All right, pretty satisfied. The final remaining thing to do is to cut the flange way. I've cut the flange ways for all of the previous frog rails and guard rails, and I've cleaned them up, but let's do that now for you. I'm going to take a short section of hacksaw blade, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that the teeth are not cutting. I'm going to position it against the inside railhead and just drag it slightly. I'm just creating a little trough through that soft solder. Nice soft route. Once I've got a nice route, I can angle the blade in towards the railhead and make sure that I'm cutting a nice, smooth, straight line right up against the railhead. And as I get that line, I bring the saw blade back up to parallel, and with pressure towards the inside of the rail, I keep cutting. I want to take this down to about the level of my flange weight depth, but it's not crucial yet. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to tilt the blade in towards the wing rail, and I'm going to again just make sure I get a nice straight edge against the wing rail. And as I feel confident that I've got that, I'll bring the hacksaw back up to perpendicular, but this time I'll put pressure inward towards the base of the wing rail, and I'll cut downward. So now with just a series of cuts slightly in towards the web of the standard gauge and slightly in towards the web of the wing rail, and in the middle I begin to gouge out the flangeway to the width and the depth that I need. Alright, so there's one. Now we need to do the narrow gauge flangeway. The narrow gauge flangeway is on a curve. So this is where we're going to be making a curved frog. And in the middle of it is the rail head, the hard rail head of the nickel silver of the through route standard gauge. So I'm going to come over again. I'm going to start back at the inside of the narrow gauge, and I'm just going to gently try and remove the solder right next to the railhead. I don't want to remove railhead yet. At some point I'll have a guideway deep enough that I now start to bite into the railhead of the standard gauge through route. Here's the time to take it slow. You don't want to scuff up that railhead. You want to make nice perpendicular cuts, because that'll become the point of the frog. And because the narrow gauge rail is curved through this point, I can bend the hacksaw blade slightly to conform to the radius of that curve. I'm currently pulling it towards me so that I'm following the contour of the inside of the railhead of the narrow gauge diverging route. Now I'm going to angle it and push it away from me a little bit to match the gauge width of the wing rail flangeway. I'm just now starting to get through the standard gauge railhead down into the standard gauge web base. I'm starting to match the depth of the previous narrow gauge flangeway, or excuse me, common gauge flangeway. It's coming together nicely. Okay, I'm going to go back later off camera and take that flange weight to depth. But the last thing I want to show you is dressing the top of the rails. I may have a little bit of elevation difference between my rail heads, and I might have some solder that is protruding up, and with a jeweler's flat file, just a gentle few strokes to make sure that it's smooth and level. When I'm done with that, I'm going to grab a piece of fine sandpaper. I'm going to sand the hairline grooves out of the rail. And then finally, my abrasive rail cleaner, and this is to give it a nice polish. I'll work on this a little while to get a nice polish on those rail heads. If I come back later and do a little flange work, that shouldn't affect the top of the rails. You want to get those micro scratches out of the top of the rails because that's where dirt will collect. Let me tell you that the way I have tapered my guardrail points, they are sharp. I have poked the tips of my fingers doing this. Be careful. There we are. We're now complete with our guardrails, our frog rails, and our wing rails. See you next time.